They didn't tie her to punish her, they tied her to wait. And out here waiting could be worse than any sentence a man might hand down. Because the desert never rushed and the things that moved through it were patient. And Ethan Cole knew that the moment he saw the shape ahead of him, barely more than a shadow against the pale dirt, a figure still when everything else breathed with wind, and before he even dismounted, he heard it, not close, not yet, but carried thin across the open miles, the low restless calls that meant something was circling, something watching, something deciding when to come closer. And that was when he saw her clearly, wrists bound to a splintered post hammered into the ground, clothing torn by time and weather, not by struggle, her head lowered as if she had already accepted the long stretch of hours ahead. And for a second Ethan didn't move, because men didn't end up like this by accident. Not in this territory, not without reason, and reason out here usually belonged to someone with more power than mercy. He stepped closer anyway, boots pressing into dust that hadn't been disturbed since whoever left her walked away, and she lifted her head just enough for him to see her eyes, dark, steady, and far more aware than someone waiting to be saved should have been. "Don't," she said, voice dry but certain, not a plea, not fear, a warning, and Ethan paused, hand hovering near the knot at her wrists, the rope rough, tied in a way he'd seen before, but couldn't place yet. "They'll think it was you," she added, her gaze shifting not to him but past him, toward the ridgeline that cut the sky in a thin sharp line about 100 yards out, and that was when Ethan felt it, not a sound, not movement, just that quiet pressure a man learned to trust when he'd spent too many years alone, the feeling of eyes, more than one, watching without stepping forward, and suddenly the scene changed. What he saw wasn't just a woman left behind, it was a story already told by someone else. A story where he was about to step into the wrong part without knowing the ending. He glanced back at her, at the rope digging into her skin, at the way she stood. Without leaning, refusing to show weakness even now. And whatever story had been written didn't sit right with him. Not with the way the knot was tied. Not with the distance to the nearest settlement. Not with the fact that no one who wanted justice would leave a person like this and walk away. Justice made noise. This was silence, deliberate and cold. "You're going to bring trouble," she said again, softer now, like she wasn't trying to stop him anymore, just telling him the truth. And Ethan gave the smallest shake of his head, more to himself than to her, because trouble was already here, it just hadn't stepped into the light yet. And slowly, without reaching for his gun, without raising his voice, he drew the knife from his belt, the steel catching a thin line of sun, and as he moved it toward the rope, he kept his eyes not on his hands, but on that empty ridge, because whatever came next wasn't going to wait for him to finish. The blade touched the rope, and for a moment nothing in the world seemed to move except the slow drift of dust across the ground. And Ethan Cole kept his breathing even, steady, the way a man does when he knows he is being watched by more than the open sky. Because out here a wrong move did not come with warning, it came with consequence. And the woman did not flinch when the knife pressed close to her wrists. She only closed her eyes briefly, as if measuring something far deeper than the cut itself. "You still have time to walk away," she said, her voice quieter now, almost carried off by the wind, and Ethan answered without looking at her. "So did whoever left you here." And that was when the first strand gave way, a soft sound. Almost nothing, but it carried farther than it should have, like a signal across the still air, and Ethan felt it again, that pressure from the ridge, heavier now. No longer just watching but deciding, and he did not rush, did not turn, because men who rushed in moments like this often made the wrong story look true, and whatever story was being told about this woman, he was already standing inside it. The rope loosened another inch, and as it did something small shifted near the knot, something that caught the light for half a heartbeat, not natural, not part of the rope itself, and Ethan slowed his hand, letting the blade hover just long enough to see it clearly, a thin piece of metal pressed into the fibers, worn but deliberate, like it had been placed there rather than caught by accident, and his eyes narrowed slightly, because he had seen work like that before, not from tribes, not from wanderers, but from men who believed in order, men who wore badges and called their decisions law. And the woman opened her eyes again, watching him now instead of the ridge, as if she understood the shift in him without needing to ask. "You see it," she said, not a question, and Ethan did not answer right away. He just cut the last of the rope free and stepped back a pace, not touching her, not guiding her, leaving the space between them open so that anyone watching would see exactly what was happening. Nothing hidden, nothing forced, and she lowered her arms slowly. The marks on her skin deep but steady, like she had endured worse than this and would endure more if needed. And for a moment they stood there in silence, two strangers in the middle of a place that did not forgive mistakes. And then the wind shifted, just enough to carry a different sound down from the ridge. Not voices, not yet, but movement, controlled, measured, and closer than before. And Ethan slid the knife back into his belt with deliberate care, his hands empty now, visible, because whatever came next would not be solved with speed or strength. And the woman took a single step back, creating distance between them, not in fear but in understanding. And that was when the first figure appeared against the sky, still as stone, watching them both, and then another, and another, until the ridge was no longer empty at all, and Ethan realized that the moment he chose not to walk away had already been seen, already judged, and whatever truth he had found in that rope might not reach them in time. No one spoke, and somehow that silence carried more weight than any shout ever could, because the men on the ridge did not rush down. They did not reach for weapons, they simply watched, and that kind of watching meant they had already decided what they believed, and Ethan Cole knew that belief, once formed out here, did not bend easily. It broke things instead. The woman shifted her stance slightly, not closer to him, not farther, just enough to stand on her own balance, and her eyes moved from one figure to another above them, counting without turning her head, measuring without fear. They will not listen first, she said under her breath, her voice steady but low, like a fact. She had lived too many times to doubt, and Ethan kept his hands where they could be seen, empty, open, the knife gone, the distance between them clear. Then they will watch, he replied, not raising his voice, not looking up yet, because sometimes a man earned more by refusing to react than by explaining too soon. The wind shifted again, brushing across the open ground and carrying the scent of leather and horse from above, close now, close enough to feel the presence of many instead of a few. And then one of the figures moved, stepping forward just enough for the sun to catch his outline, tall, still, the kind of stillness that came from authority rather than hesitation, and behind him the others held their positions, not scattered, not uncertain, but placed, like each step had been decided long before Ethan ever arrived. And that was when the woman spoke again, louder this time, not to Ethan, but to them, her voice rising just enough to carry up the slope, her words in a language Ethan did not understand but whose meaning did not need translation. It was not pleading, it was not fear, it was insistence, sharp and clear. And for a moment nothing answered her, no movement, no reply, just the quiet stretch of air between two sides that no longer shared the same truth. And Ethan finally lifted his gaze to meet the eyes above, not challenging, not lowering his own, simply meeting them as they were. And in that moment he saw it, not anger first, not even judgment, but certainty, the kind that came from seeing something with your own eyes and never questioning what it meant. They had seen a man with a blade near a bound woman. They had seen him cut her free. They had seen her step away, and whatever happened before that had already been erased by what they believed they witnessed. And Ethan felt the weight of that settle in, heavy and quiet, because truth out here did not travel as fast as sight, and sometimes it did not travel at all. The leader on the ridge took one more step forward, and though he did not raise a hand or speak a word, the air itself seemed to tighten, the others behind him shifting just enough to show they would move when he did. And beside Ethan, the woman exhaled slowly, not in relief, not in fear, but in recognition of what came next. And then she did something that made Ethan's jaw tighten just slightly. She took another step away from him, widening the distance further, separating their shadows on the ground as if drawing a line that had not been there before. And when she spoke again, her voice was softer, meant only for him now. "You should not have stayed," she said, not as blame, but as truth. And Ethan did not answer, because he already knew that. He had known it the moment he saw the ridge fill with silent figures. But leaving had never been the question. Not once he saw the rope. Not once he saw the metal hidden in its knot. And above them, The first man began to descend, slow, deliberate, every step chosen, and Ethan understood that whatever happened next would not be decided by words alone. And whatever truth he held in his mind was about to be tested against what they had already decided to believe. The man descending from the ridge did not hurry, and that told Ethan Cole more than speed ever could, because a man who rushed was uncertain, but a man who walked like that had already decided what truth he carried down with him. Each step measured across the slope until he stood no more than 20 feet away, close enough for the sun to reveal the lines of his face. Older, marked by years that had taught him to trust what he saw and question very little beyond it, and behind him the others, spread out without a word, forming a quiet circle that never fully closed, not yet, but close enough to remind Ethan that every direction now belonged to someone else. The leader's eyes moved first to the woman, then to Ethan, then to the empty space between them where the rope had fallen, and he spoke a single sentence in his own language, low, controlled, and the woman answered immediately, her voice sharper now, not pleading but pushing back, and though Ethan could not understand the words, he could feel the shift in tone. This was not a conversation. This was a dispute, a line being drawn in real time. The leader listened without interruption, but his gaze did not soften. If anything, it hardened with each word she spoke, because whatever she said was fighting against something stronger than her voice, something already rooted in what had been seen from above. And then he turned to Ethan, his English careful but clear. "You cut her free," he said, not asking, just placing the fact in the air between them. And Ethan nodded once, slow, deliberate. "She was tied," he answered, keeping his voice even. Neither defensive nor proud, just true. And the man's eyes narrowed slightly, not in anger, but in calculation. "And you were there when she stood alone," he continued, and Ethan understood then that this was not about what he had done. It was about what it looked like he had done, and appearances out here were often treated as proof. "I found her that way," Ethan replied, and for a brief second the wind passed between them, carrying nothing but dust and distance. And the leader glanced down at the ground, at the cut rope lying near Ethan's boots, and something in that glance made Ethan's attention sharpen, because it was not curiosity, it was recognition, quick and almost hidden, and then gone, replaced again by that same steady certainty. And the woman stepped forward then, closing part of the space she had created earlier, her voice rising again in her own language, stronger this time, insistent, and she pointed not at Ethan, but at the rope, at the ground, at the small place where truth still rested unnoticed. And the leader followed her gesture, but only for a moment, just long enough to see what she wanted him to see. And then he looked back at Ethan, and Ethan felt it, that hesitation, small but real, like a crack in something that had seemed solid only seconds before. And still, the man did not bend, not yet, because belief, once formed, does not step aside easily for doubt. And behind him the others remained still, waiting, not for explanation, but for decision. And Ethan knew that whatever came next would turn on something small, something easily missed, something that could either hold the truth or bury it completely. And slowly, without breaking eye contact, he shifted his foot just enough to reveal the rope more clearly. In the dust, not pointing, not forcing, just letting it be seen for what it was. And for the first time since he stepped into that valley, the silence changed, no longer heavy with judgment alone, but edged now with something else, something uncertain, something that had not been there before. And sometimes, out here, that was the only space truth ever needed to begin speaking. The silence held, but it was no longer the same silence that had settled when the men first appeared on the ridge. This one had weight in a different way, like something unseen had stepped into the space between them and refused to leave. And the leader's eyes lowered again, not to Ethan this time, but to the rope lying half buried in the dust. And for a long second he did not move, did not speak, he simply looked. And Ethan Cole understood that look, because it was not the look of a man searching for truth. It was the look of a man deciding whether he wanted to see it. And beside him the woman stood still, her breathing even, her gaze fixed not on the leader, but on the same piece of rope, as if everything now depended on whether that small detail was allowed to matter. The wind shifted once more, brushing a thin layer of dust aside, just enough to expose the fibers more clearly. and with it, the small piece of metal woven into the knot caught the light again. Faint, easy to miss, but once seen, impossible to ignore, and the leader's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, not in anger, but in recognition, the kind that came from memory, from knowing something that did not belong where it was found. And behind him, one of the other men shifted slightly, his gaze following the same line, and Ethan saw it then, the ripple, small but real, the first crack in the story they had carried down from the ridge, and still, no one spoke, because words would force a direction, and no one here was ready to choose one yet. The leader finally stepped forward, slow, deliberate, closing the distance until he stood just a few feet from the rope, and he crouched, not taking his eyes off it, his hand hovering for a moment before touching the fibers, not grabbing, not pulling, just feeling, as if confirming what his eyes had already begun to accept. And when his fingers brushed the knot, he stopped, completely still, and the air seemed to tighten again, but differently now, no longer pressing down, but holding its breath. And Ethan did not move, did not speak, because this was not his moment to force, it was the man's moment to realize, and forcing it would only turn doubt back into resistance. The leader lifted the rope slightly, just enough to see the metal piece embedded within, turning it between his fingers, and for the first time since he had stepped down from the ridge, something in his expression shifted, subtle, controlled, but undeniable. And when he stood again, he did not look at Ethan right away. He looked at the woman, and there was something in that look that had not been there before. Not trust, not yet, but something closer to listening. And she met his gaze without lowering hers, steady, unwavering, and spoke again in her own language, slower this time, not pushing, but placing each word carefully. And the leader listened, truly listened now, his eyes no longer fixed on what he had seen before, but on what stood in front of him. And when he finally turned back to Ethan, the certainty that had filled his gaze earlier was no longer complete. It had been cut, just like the rope, and in its place was something far more dangerous, doubt. Because doubt did not end a story, it changed it. And stories that changed in the middle often revealed things no one was prepared to face. And somewhere behind them, far out across the open land, the distant calls that had circled earlier began to fade, as if whatever had been waiting no longer found reason to come closer. But Ethan knew that what mattered was not what left, it was what remained. And what remained now was a truth that had just begun to surface, fragile, incomplete, and standing in the middle of men who were deciding whether to accept it or bury it where it could never be found. The leader held the rope a moment longer than necessary, not because he needed to see more, but because he needed time to understand what it meant. And when he finally let it fall back into the dust, it no longer looked like a simple thing left behind. It looked like a question that refused to stay buried. And the air between everyone shifted again, quieter now, but sharper, as if every man present had begun to rethink what he believed. And that was when a new sound carried across the valley. Faint at first, then clearer, the steady rhythm of approaching horses, not many, but enough to pull every gaze toward the far edge of the land where heat and distance blurred shapes into shadows. And Ethan Cole felt it before he saw it. That tightening in the chest that came when something unfinished was about to be forced into the open. The leader straightened slowly, his eyes narrowing toward the horizon, and the others turned with him, their formation adjusting without command, instinct, guiding them into a line that faced whatever was coming. And beside Ethan, the woman's expression changed for the first time since he had seen her. Not fear, not relief, but recognition. And it was not the kind that welcomed what approached, it was the kind that prepared for it. "They are not yours," she said quietly, her voice steady but low, and Ethan did not ask who she meant, because he already knew. The shape of the riders became clearer with each passing second, silhouettes against the light, moving with confidence that did not belong to travelers or wanderers, but to men who believed the land would not deny them. And when they drew closer, the details came into view, hats worn low, coats carrying dust from long miles, and at the front, a man whose posture alone told its own story, upright, controlled, certain, the kind of certainty that did not come from truth, but from power. And when he reined his horse to a stop within speaking distance, he did not look at the leader first. He looked at Ethan, then at the woman, and finally at the rope on the ground. and a thin smile touched his face, brief and almost hidden, as if something had gone exactly as planned. "Looks like you found her," he said, his voice smooth, practiced, the tone of a man used to being believed before he had even finished speaking, and the leader's gaze shifted toward him, sharp now, measuring, and for the first time since he had stepped down from the ridge, uncertainty met something stronger than itself. Because this man did not carry doubt, he carried control. "She was left here," the leader said, his words careful, watching, and the rider nodded once, slow, as if confirming something already known. "She ran," he replied, glancing briefly at the woman. "After what she did, we could not let her go far." And the words hung in the air, simple, direct, and dangerously complete, because they offered a story that fit too easily into what had already been seen. And Ethan felt the shift immediately, the fragile doubt that had begun to form now pressed by something heavier, something louder, and beside him the woman did not speak. Not yet, because she knew what Ethan was only just beginning to understand, that truth did not always win by being seen. Sometimes it had to survive being replaced first, and the man on the horse looked down again at the rope, then back at the leader, his expression calm, almost helpful. "We tied her to keep her from running again," he added, and though his voice did not rise, the meaning behind it did, filling the space with a version of events that demanded belief. And Ethan knew then that the small piece of metal in that knot was no longer just evidence. It was the only thing standing between two completely different stories, and only one of them would be allowed to remain when this moment ended. The man on horseback did not rush his next words, because he did not need to. He spoke like someone who understood that once a story was placed in the air, most men would grab onto it before asking where it came from. And the leader stood still, listening, not nodding, not agreeing, but not rejecting it either. And that was enough to let the weight of those words begin to settle over the others, slow and quiet, like dust covering tracks that had not yet been followed. And Ethan Cole watched it happen, the way doubt could be pushed aside not by truth, but by confidence, by tone, by the simple act of speaking first and speaking clean. And beside him the woman's shoulders remained straight, her gaze fixed on the rider, not in fear, but in something sharper, something that refused to bend even as the ground beneath her shifted. "You say she ran," the leader finally said, his voice measured, holding both sides of the moment without choosing one, and the rider inclined his head slightly, as if the answer was obvious. "She was seen near the settlement," he replied, "and not alone." And though the words were simple, they carried implication, the kind that did not need detail to be believed. And Ethan felt the circle tighten again, not in movement, but in thought, the fragile space that had opened around the rope now closing under the weight of a story that fit easier than the truth. And for a second it looked like that would be enough, like the moment would pass and settle in the direction it had been pushed. But then the leader's eyes dropped once more, not to the rider, not to the woman, but to the rope still lying in the dust, and he stepped toward it again, slower this time, as if each movement carried more consequence than before. And when he bent down, he did not just touch it, he lifted it fully, turning it in his hand so that the light struck the knot from a different angle, and the small piece of metal caught that light again, brighter now, impossible to ignore. And this time, the rider saw it too, just for a fraction of a second, but it was enough, because something in his expression shifted, quick, controlled, but real, the kind of shift a man makes when something he did not expect appears in front of others. And Ethan saw it, and he knew the leader saw it too, because the leader did not look up right away. He kept his eyes on the knot, on the metal, on the detail that did not belong to the story just told. And when he finally stood, he did not face Ethan first. He faced the rider, holding the rope slightly forward, not accusing, not declaring, just showing. And the silence that followed was different from all the others that had come before. This one did not wait. It demanded. And the rider's gaze moved from the rope to the leader, then briefly to Ethan. And for the first time since he had arrived, his confidence did not fill the space completely. There was a gap now, small, but enough for something else to enter. And the woman spoke then, her voice steady, not raised, not pleading, but placed carefully into that gap, each word deliberate. And though Ethan still did not understand her language, he did not need to. because the meaning was no longer hidden in words, it was in what had been revealed, and the leader listened, not just with his ears, but with his eyes, with the rope still in his hand, with the truth sitting there between all of them, and Ethan realized that the moment had shifted again, not fully, not safely, but enough that the story could no longer move forward without answering what had just been uncovered. And sometimes that was all it took, not a fight, not a confession, just a single detail that refused to stay buried, and the quiet strength of someone willing to let it be seen. The rope hung between the leader's hands, not heavy, not large, yet it carried more weight than anything else in that valley, because it no longer belonged to one story, it belonged to all of them. And for a long moment no one tried to take it back, not the rider, not the woman, not even the men behind the leader, because they all understood that whatever came next would begin with what that small piece of metal meant. And the rider shifted slightly in his saddle, just enough to show that. Stillness no longer came as easily to him as it had before, his eyes moving once more to the knot, then away, then back again, measuring how much had been seen, how much could still be denied. "It is just a rope," he said finally, his voice calm, but not as smooth as before, like something beneath it had tightened, and the leader did not answer right away. He only looked at him, not with anger, not with accusation, but with something quieter and far more difficult to face, expectation, and Ethan Cole felt it too, the shift in the air, because this was no longer about what had happened earlier, it was about what would be admitted now. And the woman stepped forward again, not close to Ethan, not close to the rider, but into the space between them, her presence steady, grounded, as if she had already accepted whatever outcome would follow. And she spoke, slowly, clearly, each word placed like a stone. And though Ethan still did not understand the language, he understood the effect, because the men behind the leader did not move the same way they had before, their attention no longer fixed on him, no longer fixed on her, but drawn instead to the rope, to the leader, to the rider, as if the center of the story had shifted away from accusation and into something deeper, something harder to control. And the leader raised the rope slightly, just enough for everyone to see, the knot, the metal, the detail that did not belong to the explanation that had been offered. And when he spoke, his voice carried differently now, not questioning, not uncertain, but steady in a new way. "This is not how our people bind," he said, the words simple, but they cut through everything that had been said before, because they did not argue, they did not accuse, they simply refused to agree. And the rider's gaze sharpened, his posture straightening, not in confidence, but in response, because the ground beneath him had changed. "We did what was needed," he replied, but now his words sounded smaller, narrower, as if they had to work harder to fill the space they once owned. And Ethan did not speak, did not step forward, because this was no longer his place to stand. The truth had moved beyond him. It was now between men who could either accept it or turn away from it. And the leader took one slow step closer to the rider, not threatening, not raising his voice, just closing the distance enough that the rope no longer sat between them. It became something held up to both of them at once, and for a brief second, the valley fell into a silence that felt complete, as if even the wind had chosen to wait. And in that silence, something changed, not loudly, not dramatically, but undeniably. The rider's eyes flickered once, just once, toward the metal piece in the knot, and in that flicker, everything that had been hidden became visible, not to everyone, but to the one man who needed to see it. And the leader's expression did not harden, it did not rise in anger, it settled, like a decision made without needing to be spoken aloud. And when he lowered the rope, he did not throw it aside. He placed it gently back into the dust, as if returning it to where the truth had first been left behind. And then he turned, not to his men, not to Ethan, but to the woman. And in that turn, the entire balance of the moment shifted, because the story that had been told no longer held, and what replaced it did not need to be declared, it only needed to be recognized. And out here, recognition was the closest thing to justice a man could offer without drawing blood or raising a hand. No one raised a voice, and no one reached for anything at their side. But the decision had already been made, not in words, not in orders, but in the way the leader stood between the woman and the rider now. Not blocking, not threatening, simply present, and that presence carried more authority than anything spoken before. The rider remained still in his saddle, his posture controlled, but the certainty that had brought him into the valley no longer filled the space around him. It had thinned, replaced by something quieter, something that understood the ground had shifted beneath him. And for a moment it seemed like he might speak again, might try to reshape the story, but he did not. Because there are moments when even the most practiced voice knows that words will only make the truth sharper, and the men behind the leader adjusted their stance, not closing in, not advancing, but no longer aligned with the rider either. Their attention now centered where it should have been from the beginning, on what had been revealed rather than what had been claimed, and the woman stepped forward slowly, her movement calm, measured, until she stood beside the leader. Not behind him, not protected, but equal in the space that had finally opened for her. And she did not look at the rider. She did not seek anything from him. Her gaze remained forward, steady, as if she had already moved past the need for explanation. And Ethan Cole watched it all without stepping in, without adding a word, because this was never his story to control, only a moment he had chosen not to walk away from. And sometimes that was enough to change everything. The wind moved again. Across the valley, lighter now, carrying away the last of the tension that had built in silence, and the rope lay where it had been placed, no longer hidden, no longer ignored, just a piece of truth left in plain sight for anyone willing to see it. The leader turned his head slightly toward the rider, not with anger, not with challenge, but with a quiet finality that needed no explanation, and after a long second, the rider drew a slow breath, then pulled lightly on the reins, his horse shifting beneath him. And without another word, he turned, guiding it back the way he had come, not hurried, not chased, but leaving nonetheless, and the men who had arrived with him followed in the same silence, their shapes growing smaller against the wide stretch of land until they were nothing more than shadows again, and then gone, and no one celebrated, no one spoke of victory, because out here justice did not arrive with noise. It settled in quietly, like something that had always been there but had finally been seen. The leader lowered his gaze for a brief moment, then stepped aside, creating space not just in distance, but in meaning, and the woman stood there for a second longer, then turned, her eyes meeting Ethan's for the first time without warning, without distance, and there was no gratitude in that look, no apology, just understanding, clear and steady, the kind that did not need to be spoken to be felt. And Ethan gave the smallest nod in return, then stepped back, giving her the same space she had given him earlier. And as the group began to move away, not in formation, not in urgency, but with purpose, Ethan remained where he was, alone again in the open valley, the dust settling around his boots, the sky stretching wide above him. And after a long moment, he turned as well, walking toward his horse without looking back, because some things did not need to be witnessed twice. And out here, the difference between a man and everything else that walked the land was simple. The wolves followed hunger, but men chose what they left behind, and that choice was the only thing that ever truly stayed.